Good afternoon,
Good afternoon.
From the Grassmarket in Edinburgh to Joe and Mike's Virtual Tours of Scotland. We're about to do a bit of the Grassmarket. If you remember last week, Joe did the first bit of the Grassmarket. I'm going to do a little bit, and mainly the Cowgate, which leads off the Grassmarket. So we've got quite a cold afternoon today. It's quite sunny, but we've got a nice light coming through, a nice wintry light that's reflecting off the buildings here. So first of all, I'm going to walk us up a little bit. Please let us know. Feedback is so good for us, how things are, sound-wise. And Joe is going to be talking as well. So
I'm here. Good afternoon, everybody. It's 3 o'clock. I know we've got some regular viewers here, so welcome back to Edinburgh.
So we're going to look up the street. I know that Joe covered it last time, but it's always worth looking again because these beautiful Christmas decorations that are up here, this is called Porteous Street, and this was developed really in the 1820s, 30s. It used to be what was called the West Bow, and if we swing around you can still see the old name of the West Bow on the building here. Now this was the main access from the west of Edinburgh into the centre of Edinburgh up to the castle, and it was a very zigzag type of street. Then they thought to improve it. If you're bringing in carriages and people were more mobile, not wanting to be on their feet all the time, then you had to have a smoother access. So as you can see, it sort of curves up quite gently up and round the corner there. Now I'm going to swing us around a bit. Maybe Joe can catch the sunlight up there on the tenements. Now when people come down to the Grassmarket, and it's a very popular place to come to have a bar meal, sit outside, maybe not so much today, then they look around and see all these quaint buildings. It's a bit of a mixture because if we're going back to, say, the 18th and 19th centuries particularly, it was what we called a slum area, S-L-U-M, meaning it was a very poor part of Edinburgh where there was a lot of overcrowding in the houses. So in the later part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, there was a lot of demolition and what we call tenement infilling. So there are some older buildings here, 17th century, but many of the buildings date from the 1920s and the 1930s, would you believe? And if we walk down a bit towards Armstrong's, is a vintage clothing shop. And if you're here in Edinburgh, you want to be cool in the height of fashion, you might want to get a bit of tartan, Highland dress, then it's a good place to get a second-hand kilt. And the kilts are so well made and tailored because it's vintage clothing. Now, if we swing around here to this police box, this was designed by a character who was one of the architects who had a lot to do with tidying up the buildings here, and he was called Ebenezer McCrae.
A great name, isn't it, Ebenezer?
Great name. In the 1920s and 1930s, he was responsible for remodelling what we call the tenement infilling, but he was also the man who invented the police box. Now these police boxes are not used by the police today, but they used to be used very much. It used to be having a hotline to the police station when you had what you call your bobbies on the beat. And they used to go in there and brew up their tea, and they would have a direct telephone line to the police station. Today, you may look at this and connect it to Doctor Who, if you're a fan of that series, because of course the TARDIS, Doctor Who's time-travelling contraption, is based on one of these old police boxes. Today they're used for coffee, takeaway coffees and snacks and so on, as you can see. So go back to the 20s and the 30s. Now if we swing along here across the West Bow, or Victoria Street as we know it today, we'll look over here to this Warden's Close. Now it doesn't look the sort of place that you would want to go up very much, but it was even worse. If you can think back to the 19th century, was a place called Hatter's Land. Hatters, because people would make hats, and it was immensely overcrowded. It had a very bad reputation. In fact, you would have as many as 60 to 70 people sharing a room in there. And it was said there was more cases of fever in Hatter's Land than you would find in a wet pool of filth. So imagine that. So this is no longer there, Hatter's Land, and it was taken away in the 19th century and replaced. So the building you can see in front of us is much more recent. So there was a big move to tidy up, to clean up the Grassmarket. Now, swinging round again, if we take a view along the left-hand side by Armstrong's and so on, and then if we can pan over into the centre where we've got a telephone box, around this area was the gallows. And Joe spoke about that last week. I want to talk about an event in 1736. Now, Scotland had been united with England in the Act of Union in 1707, and many people are very unhappy with it because, with immediate effect, additional taxes were levied on the people and duties, and everything became more expensive. But one of the worst things they did was what was called Malt Tax. By taxing malt, it meant that beer, alcohol like drinks, went up in price and became very expensive. So the Scots, weren't at all happy, and there was a sort of alliance with smuggling. Well, over in Fife, in Pittenweem in Fife, we have a couple of characters, and one was called Andrew Wilson, and the other one was called George Robertson. Now, they had goods in their house which were suspected to have been smuggled goods, so the excise officer came to their house and took away a lot of their belongings and held these belongings in the customs house in Pittenweem. Now, Robertson and Wilson weren't too pleased about that, so what they did is they broke into the customs house and took their goods back again. Now, they were outraged, the authorities, that they had done that, because there was big laws against smuggling, and they were held to account. They were brought to Edinburgh. They were taken to the court. They were found guilty. There was actually 3 of them, but one of the guys got away because his crime didn't really seem to be so severe as the other 2. But anyway, Wilson and Robertson were condemned to death to be hanged here in the gallows. Now, this was in 1736. Previous to the day of the hanging, there was a church service, as always was the case with condemned criminals, had to attend church. And on that occasion, George Robertson distracted the authorities, the guards in the church, and made it so, Andrew Wilson, made it so that George Robertson escaped. So Andrew Robertson pushed George Robertson and caused a bit of a kerfuffle, distracted the guards. Robertson escaped out of Edinburgh, and he ended up in the Netherlands and set up an inn in Rotterdam. Now, Andrew Wilson was still there. He was quite a big man, and there was a lot of affinity with these smugglers from the people of Edinburgh, because they believed they were doing a good deed, because all these taxes they saw was immoral, especially to the poor people. So they were seen as a bit of folk heroes. So people rallied to the support of Andrew Wilson. Anyway, he was dragged. Andrew Wilson was taken down here and hung. Around him was the Edinburgh City Guard, and the captain was Captain John Porteous, who had a very bad reputation. He wasn't liked at all. He was seen as a bit of a bully, but he had surrounded himself with 150 members of the Edinburgh City Guard, just in case there was any revolt by the people. Anyway, Andrew Wilson was hanged, and as his body was being cut down, some children threw stones at the hangman. And this was a bit of a tradition, but John Porteous was on a very short fuse, and at that point he suspected the mob were going to revolt because the stones were being thrown at the executioner and the crowd were getting very anxious. So Porteous gave the order to fire into the crowd, and he fired and killed a couple of people at that point. And the mob, as they were thought of or termed, the citizens of Edinburgh, started being really, really loud and supportive of or against Porteous, and it was a rabble. The city guard with Porteous were marching up the West Bow, back up to the toll booth where they'd come from, and the crowd were following them, shouting. And at that point, Porteous gave the order to shoot again, to shoot above the heads of the people as a warning, but they ended up taking out some people, killing some people who were hanging out of the windows here, who had been observing the hanging. Well, Porteous, the people of Edinburgh, were not at all happy with him, and he was taken to account. He was taken in front of a magistrate, and because he was being accused of murder. And the magistrate decided to come up with a verdict of that Porteous had to be hung, just as he had been in charge of the guard at the hanging. Now, there was delays and delays to Porteous's event when he was going to be brought down here, because the government in London weren't at all happy, and they ended up delaying the execution. In particular, Queen Caroline, who was the wife of an absent King George II, and she said was going to give a pardon to Porteous. Now, this made the people of Edinburgh even more volatile and mad. So Porteous was being held in the Tolbooth prison. One night in September 1736, the mob surrounded the prison. They burnt down the door of the prison. They went in, they dragged John Porteous down from a chimney where he had been hiding in his nightshirt only, dragged him down here to the Grassmarket, and there was about 4,000 of the Edinburgh citizens who were doing this. So it was quite an event. It was called the Porteous Riot. On the way down, they got a piece of rope out of a rope maker's. They strung it around Porteous's neck and hung him from a dyer's pole from one of these buildings here, and killed him, hung him. The authorities were outraged. The government in London was outraged. The King and Queen were also so outraged that they were able to displace the Provost and Magistrate of Edinburgh, and they were able to fine the city £2,000. They were on a very, it was a very dicey, very tricky situation, because they didn't want to enrage the Edinburgh mob too much.
We don't want to wind up the Edinburgh mob.
Don't wind up the Edinburgh mob, but they backed down a bit. But they had given a warning. The £2,000 went to the widow of John Porteous. So in 1736, September 1736, was the Porteous Riot. Quite an event. Okay, so we'll move on.
It just goes to show that healthy disregard for authority that all the people in Scotland still have.
Yes. So we're walking along to the Cowgate, which is leading to the east of the Grassmarket. Now, the Grassmarket was a glacial valley. It was formed about 10,000 years ago with the melting of ice. It carved out, scooped out the earth and substance to make this gap, this enclosed open space for a livestock market. And the Cowgate's so named because that's where they would bring the cattle in to sell, but also other livestock too, like horses and sheep, you name it. would come in here. It was thought to be very convenient for managing livestock because there was a passage of air which flew quite liberally, so it was thought that it would take away all the smells and unsavoury legacy of all these activities that was happening here with livestock. So the Cowgate. It's quite busy just now because there's a new hotel being built. It's called the Virgin Hotel by Richard Branston, if you're familiar with him, an entrepreneur, hotelier, as well as airline.
I think it's quite ironic that we've got one of these 5-star hotels going up there, Mike, right next to a delousing station.
Yes.
This church here, this building, used to be one of the famous delousing stations for the poor.
Yeah.
Going right next to brand new Virgin Hotel going up.
In fact, this building here is a free church of Scotland, and we mentioned in an earlier tour about the division in the Church of Scotland, and there was many alternative churches built, and this was one of them. It was supposed to have a spire at the top of it. As you can see, it finishes in a very unusual tower, so they only got the tower built there. So we're going to carefully, because there's a bit of building work going on here, see if we can cross the street. And we've got to do our social distancing as well, of course, and got a nice view, I don't know if Joe can capture it, of the castle just now in the sunlight just down there at the end of the Grassmarket. It's quite stunning at the moment. Just can't get over the light today up in the top of the central library up on the left there. It was gifted by one Andrew Carnegie, who was a self-made billionaire probably in terms of today's money, but involved with the steel industry in the United States and railroads. Famous son of Scotland, of Dunfermline of course, but that central library, very important resource.
Of course, in Scotland, if you ever wanted to tap your dad for money for doing anything, you'd always turn and say, "Who do you think I am? Andrew Carnegie?" So you always knew you were never going to get any money out of his pocket.
Yes, yes, exactly. Now, I talked about slums as being poor, very poor, overcrowded areas. In the 19th century, this area was hugely crowded by many Irish people who'd come over here for different reasons, because of the potato famine over there, although we had a potato famine here also in Scotland. So many Irish people stayed here, and one that I'm going to talk about is James Connolly, and up on the left hand side, if Joe can catch it, there are a couple of pictures. James Connolly was from Ireland, and born in the 1860s, I think 1868, and he was one of 3 brothers who was born and brought up in the Cowgate, or Little Ireland as it's called. His family were very poor, they were labourers. At the age of 11, James left school and started working as a labourer, and at the age of 14, would you believe, he joined the army. He lied about his age, and he gave another name. His name was Reid, as opposed to Connolly. He joined the British Army. Several years in the British Army, went to Ireland, and he was there when they had what was called the Land Wars, which was kind of conflict over land ownership, with a move away from living in the country, and people were wanting to have more say in their own destiny, and he viewed that with a bit of distress. He was always on the side of the working class, was James Connolly. He's a bit of a hero, a socialist. Anyway, he gave up the army when he heard that they were going to India, and he was viewing it as a very much an instrument of a capitalist society. And so he became quite disillusioned. He came back to Scotland, he married, He set up business as a cobbler, making shoes, but he wasn't very good at that. He gave up on that. He went to America, and he became connected with the Socialist Party of America before going back to Ireland. Now, he was very much connected with the thinking of people like Karl Marx and so on, and socialism. He was also connected with the industrial workers of the world. So he was very much in touch with socialism. He was in touch with the Federation of Socialists here in Edinburgh as well. But he went to Ireland after all this, and he became involved with the Irish Republican Socialist Party. And he became involved too with the Irish Citizens' Army. And he was after Ireland becoming a republic. He believed that it was being controlled too much by Britain, and its economy was suffering, its people were suffering. So he was one of those who organised the Easter Rising in 1916. And you may be familiar with Michael Collins. And they were very much associated. They took over the General Post Office in Dublin in April 1916 and declared a republic. Now, the British were absolutely livid at this. They sent a warship up the River Liffey in Dublin and suppressed this rebellion. Many people died. About 450 people died, and well over 1,500 or so people were injured in a lot of street fighting, and the warship, of course, bombing the General Post Office in Dublin. Now, he was captured by the British, was James Connolly, and he was badly injured, very badly injured. He couldn't even stand, he was in the hospital. But the British showed no mercy. They took him from the hospital on a stretcher. He couldn't even walk. Took him to Kilmainham jail, tied him to a chair and shot him and killed him. Now, Irish independence didn't come at that point, but it was an instrument, the Easter Rising, eventually to cause it to happen. Now, he is much celebrated. He spoke with a Scottish accent all his life, did James Connolly, and there is a statue commemorating him in Dublin today. And this area here is where he was born, and maybe Joe can take a shot of the picture of James Connolly there. He was born in the Cowgate in Edinburgh. And you can see there we've got 1916 and the anniversary of that, which was in 2016.
And this place is still known as Little Ireland.
Still known as Little Ireland. And it's, Joe and I are showing you some of the lesser covered areas and lesser covered characters, perhaps even to locals or to people who visit Edinburgh. So we're, mind yourself, Joe, there's a bike coming, watch yourself. Yeah. Yeah, we're locals. We're interested in all these kind of lesser known.
It's nice to go off the beaten track, to take you into these places that you probably wouldn't come to as if you're here on your own. So it's good to get the local knowledge.
If we can swing around again, you can see what is called the George IV Bridge. This was built in 1820s, 1830s, and it comes over the Cowgate. The Cowgate in the 16th century was quite an upper class area of Edinburgh, would you believe. In the time of Mary Queen of Scots, the French ambassador had a lodging here, and one of the top cardinals, Cardinal Beaton, and there was a lot of very wealthy merchants stayed in the Cowgate. But during the 17th century and 18th century, they moved away, and it became slum dwellings, multiple occupancy dwellings. In fact, there was one lady discovered in a room barely 6 feet, dimensions of 6 feet, with her only light being a very small skylight. So it went from one thing to another, and of course when this bridge was in place, then many of the buildings had to be taken down as well. So it went through a huge transition. Now I'm wanting us to turn around again to see this building here, which is the Magdalene Chapel. Now this is one of my favourite pieces of architecture. Sorry, we've got a bit of jackhammering going on here, but this dates back to 1541, the year before Mary Queen of Scots was born. If you look at the bottom part of it, is the older part of it from that time. Now it was a chapel which was built by one Michael McQueen, and he was building it because back in these days they believed that they would ingratiate themselves with the afterlife, a gesture of salvation, to build a religious chapel, and he was of that belief. He died, he'd drawn up the plans for it, but his wife, one Janet Rind, carried on with the building of it. And just above the doorway is an interesting sculpture, because in addition to being a chapel, it was the guild hall of the Guild of Hammermen. Now, or incorporation of hammermen. They were trades guilds, and down here in the Cowgate especially, there was a lot of metal working. Especially in the 16th, 17th century, you think of shoe buckles, metal was used a lot more, pots and pans, belt buckles, silversmithing, exotic items, swords and all sorts. So hammermen were most important. So this was a guild hall, a meeting place for these people, but they were also a charitable organisation, and they wanted to show mercy to the poor, to people who were homeless, and there was an almshouse also, or poorhouse, attached to this guild here of the Magdalene Chapel. Now, the Magdalene Chapel eventually became Protestant. It was a Catholic chapel, but I have got a little picture to show you, because pre-Reformation, Reformation was when the religion of Scotland changed from Catholic to Presbyterian, and here we may be able to pick up these windows, which are the only existing pre-Reformation stained glass windows in Scotland in existence. So if we look up here, you can see the Royal Arms of Scotland with the lion rampant, and on the right hand side we have got the arms of Mary of Lorraine, or Mary of Guise, who was the mother of Mary Queen of Scots, and down here we have got the arms of Michael the Queen, and on the right hand side we've got the arms of Janet Rind. Now these are beautiful, and it's an amazing interior inside. Unfortunately we can't take you in today, but there are no windows, stained glass windows as old as these in existence in Scotland, so that's quite a significant thing. Magdalene Chapel, we'll move away, but we can maybe get a more distant view of it, looking back at the tower and spire.
And I would highly recommend when you come to Scotland to come down to and go inside. They're very welcoming, the people inside. That's now run by the Reformation Society, and they'd be happy to give you a little guided tour inside it. It's a real hidden gem, and it's one of these things that people will walk past, never even think about it, but as Mike says, it's got unique stained glass windows.
If you see the spire, that goes back to 1620, the tower and spire. So the 16th century bit was a bit at the bottom, but a very fine spire it is also. So we are going to wander safely, we hope. We've got a busy road, but we're going to cross over. The light is going down a bit, but I think Edinburgh is very unique, and it's great to see it.
And we did mention Hatter's Land before, and here we have Fab Hat-Tricks.
Yeah.
Shop opposite. There's a nice sky coming up at the moment. It's going to be a beautiful sunset.
Excuse us as we're going to, I'll just say another few things about the Grassmarket as we're waiting here. Grassmarket founded, well, it was given a royal charter in 1477 by King James III. Remember King James III, we were mentioning it, Craigmillar Castle, dysfunctional family and all that stuff. Well, they were given the royal assent to have livestock marketing down here. You're going to walk up Candlemaker Row now. It's a Grassmarket project here. Candlemaker Row was, not surprisingly, where the candle makers were situated. And it was an unsafe practice and a very antisocial practice, making candles. It was very smelly, melting the tallow. Often it was animal fat that they were making the candles out of. Unless you were very wealthy, then you would be commissioning them to do beeswax candles, which were perfumed. Before gas lighting, which developed in the early 19th century, candles were very important for light, of course. So they had to be situated away from the centre of town because it was antisocial, it was dangerous. They were using fire, so very sensibly they were located up here. But before we go there, I'm going to have a little look along this street here, on the left-hand side. It is called Merchant Street. Now, I'd like us to look at this tenement on the left-hand side there, because this was designed by a famous son of Edinburgh called James Craig. And you may remember him as being the man who put up the plans for Edinburgh's new town. But he was also a builder of houses, or designing houses too, not just town plans. So you can tell the difference with these little details. The lintel above the door there sticking out, and you can see the stonework as well is not the not the latest stonework, and some of it is quite roughly hewn, so you can tell it is 18th century. Now we go up here a little bit, and we've got another significant tenement here by an architect called Robert Burns. No, not the poet, but if we look at number 3 over there, and the arch over the window, this again was a very fine tenement building, and it still is today. It's got all these little extra decorative features around the doorway. If we swing around,
Just going to take in the sunset here, Mike, so people can see the
beautiful
wild colours going on at the moment.
gosh, look at that sky.
It's stunning. It's so golden.
It is just amazing. So you've
It's a
got
great time
James
of the
Craig's house there, and here is an example of what we call a truncated street. Now, Merchant Street was quite a fine street in the old town of Edinburgh, but when they were improving the access from the south of Edinburgh, they were building this George IV Bridge again, and this is another arch which is part of George IV Bridge. Then it ended up that the street was blocked at the end, and we've got, that's just behind there is the back of the Sheriff Court, and it's quite close to Chambers Street, just at the end there. And I think on the right hand side is the Augustinian Church on George IV Bridge. So this archway again is part of that whole system, that street system, which carries the street above.
And it's fair to say that Divino's is a really nice restaurant as well. It's a really nice wine bar and Italian restaurant if you're here in Edinburgh.
Great. It's good. A little hidden gem again. These streets that just lead off, and it's got the cobbles which haven't been changed, the sets on the roadway there.
And in August, when the festival's normally in full swing, this is where the people of Edinburgh go to hide from all the tourists that come over here. So we have to have our little hiding places to go to.
Absolutely. So this is a nice street. Normally we're talking about tales of that little dog, Greyfriars Bobby, if you're familiar with that. The little dog, 19th century, famous movie made by Walt Disney, concerning a dog who had great loyalty to his master, Skye Terrier. After the master died, the dog went to the cemetery and is said to have slept on the grave of his master, and is much commemorated. Now, coming up on the right hand side, if Joe can just catch these two towers here, this is Candlemaker Hall. This is 18th century building, So it is a very old listed A building from another time. Many people in this part of town are looking at Greyfriars Bobby's statue, and they may just see this as a bit of a backdrop, but wow, quite a backdrop. And if you look at the top, up to the left-hand side on the left tower, you can see there is a circular window there, and the hall today, although we're not going to take you in it, is in good condition. I'm just going to...
Some of these apartments are actually rented out by Edinburgh University.
Wow.
And I did have a friend whose kid was up here studying at Edinburgh.
Yeah.
And they moved in here. And these apartments back onto the cemetery. And the girls were terrified every single night. They actually said the place was so haunted they had to leave it. So I didn't really believe it or not, but but the kids actually were terrified, and they asked the university to move them.
Incredible. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take us a bit nearer, because I want us to look at this, what remains of this sculpture above the doorway here. Now, this is much weathered, and there's not very much of it left today, but there will be two women on either side, and a beehive at the bottom. Remember, beehive, symbolism meaning industry. But the actual Latin motto of the candle makers was Omnia Manifesta Luce. Omnia Manifesta Luce, which translates into everything will become clear in the light. And that would have been the original inscription there on that plaque for the incorporation of candle makers. Now, it is the only existing guild hall today in Edinburgh of the original incorporation. Quite significant. Just look at the stonework.
And look at the date.
And the date. 18th century, 1722. And you've got
still living in it and still got central heating.
Yes, it's been brought up to date. But you see, this is what tells you it's an old building. It's like James Craig's house down there, Robert Burns's house. The finery, the way it's finished off, it's not just like an opening, it's got all this fine surround in the lintel here as
And
well.
Phyllis has just made a comment that she's saying that when she's on tour, she's been taught to look upwards. You always got to look up. There's so many little secret things here in Edinburgh, and if you just look around you, I'm amazed at this door, because I'm not a very tall person, but even I would have to stoop to get into number 36.
Yes, they say that
They made them really short in those days.
people were quite sharp back then, yeah. So it's made of local stone, which would be sandstone, and we've got a modern bar, of course, connected to Greyfriars Bobby, the little dog I was telling you about before. Now we're going to walk very quickly, because we'll be ending the tour fairly soon, into the graveyard, because I want to show you one final thing. But look at this, just look at that sky behind the church of Greyfriars. It's worth coming in just to see that. Yeah. And it's a nice graveyard. There's a gravestone of Greyfriars Bobby. You can see all the sticks and branches that are being left.
This has become a modern tradition as well, leaving sticks for her on the grave.
What is unusual is the dog being buried in a churchyard in a graveyard, because that normally would not have been allowed. But that dog was such a local character in the folklore of Edinburgh.
This is one of my favourite places to come in Edinburgh. I think the skyline is just brilliant, looking at all the higgledy-piggledy buildings and
It's brilliant.
different towers, and it's like something like Mary Poppins. I
It
always
is.
think.
Yeah. You couldn't make it up. You know, it's just Edinburgh is such a magical place. And see the old street lamp in the graveyard, and people come in here to just walk and enjoy the view. Okay, it's a graveyard. It's got the Harry Potter connection with J.K. Rowling and some of the characters in her books.
Somebody said, why do they leave the sticks on the grave? Well, remember, he's a little dog, so you throw a stick for your dog to fetch. So people have just started to leave sticks on his grave. It's become a modern tradition. Thanks for that, Lisa. That's a good question.
Yeah, thank you. And just that sky with the George Heriot School, you can see again through the trees, very picturesque. That school dates back to the 17th century, of course. Now I'm on the hunt for a gravestone, and I do know where it is, but sometimes you have to get a map of the graveyard because there are so many graves and so many ancient graves here. And this one is it. Found it. Now, I don't know if we're going to see this because the light is failing, but this here is the grave of John Porteous, because remember we're talking about back then, 1736, when he was strung up and hanged in the Grassmarket by the city mob. Then he was taken down and his body was buried here, and this is his gravestone, John Porteous, from the Porteous Riots.
And it reads, John Porteous, a captain of the Edinburgh City Guard, murdered 7th of September 1736. There's been a murder.
That's right. Now, before I finish, I've got to tell you one other significant thing, because here in Greyfriars Churchyard, it's got a connection with the Covenanters. In 1638, the National Covenant was signed here, which was thrown out the power of the king to impose a more English religion on Scotland, which was very Presbyterian. Well, many people died for that cause, and they were hung in the Grassmarket, died there. The Magdalene Chapel that we went and looked at, there is a table in there still today where after the people had died, the bodies were taken there for preparation for burial, and that table can still be viewed today. So there's a bit of a gruesome thought.
Yeah. So Lisa's just asked another question about maps of the cemeteries. Get it from the church or online. There is a book which is published, and it's all about the Edinburgh cemeteries, and it tells you about all the great and the good and the interesting people who are actually buried in the various cemeteries around Edinburgh. And I would highly recommend it as well. I'll remember it next week, and I'll show you a photo of it.
Yeah, go for it, definitely. Now, I'd just like to thank you all for joining. I hope you enjoyed our little tour of the Grassmarket and the Cowgate.